You stand in the stone corridor of a royal palace. The walls echo with distant music, but here silence lingers like smoke. Candlelight flickers across the face of a girl no older than 13, draped in white silk, her small hands locked around a bouquet that trembles with each breath. She doesn't smile. She doesn't cry. Her face is frozen, carved in quiet terror. Behind the great doors before her, nobles wait, priests chant, and a man twice her age prepares to lift her veil. She has never seen him before tonight, never heard his voice. Her father signed the papers weeks ago, sealing her fate with ink and wax. And now the girl takes one fragile step forward toward a future she cannot choose and a night she cannot escape. It is her wedding night. But it is not love that waits on the other side. It is duty. It is blood. It is pain wrapped in velvet. And she knows this night will not end with a kiss. It will end with a wound. This is not a story of love. It is not a tale of romance, devotion, or two souls bound by choice. It is something far colder, far darker. What unfolded behind the veils of royal weddings in medieval Europe was not sacred union, it was sacrifice. The sacrifice of childhood, of safety, of choice. For centuries, young girls, some barely past their 8th birthday, were given to men they had never met, not asked, not guided, given. Handed over like letters of alliance, their value measured not in intellect or heart, but in bloodlines and heirs. Marriage, for them, was not a milestone. It was a sentence, and that sentence began on the wedding night. Tonight, behind silks and banners, beneath the eyes of bishops and barons, something terrifying is expected to happen. Something a child is not built to endure, and yet endure she must. Because her body is no longer her own, it belongs to the crown, to her father's legacy, to her husband's lineage. You've heard the legends, the gowns, the jewels, the feasts, but you haven't heard what happened after the music faded, after the doors closed. When the crowd dispersed and silence returned, these girls faced something far more violent than battle, expectation. This is not about wedding nights. This is about control. This is about fear turned into law. And this is about the forgotten queens, young, voiceless, terrified, who stepped into a chamber that would break them long before morning came. She was still playing with carved wooden animals when the letter arrived. Her nursemaid took it from the courier's hand, bowed low, and whispered something the girl didn't understand. Hours later, her father summoned her into the hall where banners swayed and firelight danced along the stone floor. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't smile. He simply said, "You are promised to Prince Aldrich of Velmer. You leave in 3 weeks." She was 10. In the world of medieval royalty, a daughter was never truly a child. She was a transaction waiting to happen, her body mapped against treaties and borders, her fate determined by men who traded kingdoms like chess pieces. The moment a noble girl reached a certain age, usually 8 or 9, whispers began. Proposals were drafted. Dowries calculated. Her name no longer meant personhood, it meant alliance. Fathers did not seek their daughters' permission. They didn't consider their hopes, fears, or dreams. Those things were irrelevant, dangerous even. A daughter with opinions was a liability. A daughter who obeyed without question was gold. These marriages weren't about affection. They were contracts forged in ink and sealed with wax, binding girls to strangers in lands they had never seen. They were expected to smile, to bow, to obey. And when the wedding night came, they were expected to bleed. Imagine the terror of knowing your childhood has an expiration date and not knowing when it will arrive. One day, you're learning to embroider birds. The next, you're fitted for a gown you don't understand, bound for a man you've never met. They called it duty. She called it disappearing. The feast had ended. The laughter faded, leaving only clinking goblets and the low hum of whispered anticipation. Servants moved like shadows, carrying candles into the bridal chamber. Outside the door, nobles gathered, not to wish well, but to witness. This was not a moment of intimacy. This was ceremony. This was the bedding. The young bride stood in the center of the room, barely able to breathe beneath the heavy silk of her gown. Her cheeks burned, not from desire, but from the gazes of a dozen strangers. Laughter echoed. Some men made jokes. Others offered advice to the groom, who stood beside her like a stranger summoned for a task. Then came the stripping, not behind closed doors, not in privacy. Before a room of lords and ladies, her gown was loosened by maids with trembling hands. Her chemise slipped away. She shivered, not from cold, but from humiliation. She was 13. She had never seen her own body in a mirror, and now it was bare before courtiers who chuckled and nodded. Tradition required it. Witnesses had to ensure the marriage was real. Royal unions meant property, land, heirs. And heirs meant bloodlines. If doubt arose later, if succession was questioned, there had to be proof that the marriage had been consummated, and so the watchers remained. Some sat, some stood by the wall, some positioned themselves near the bed. Curtains offered the illusion of modesty, but everyone knew what was happening behind them. The girl knew too. She trembled as the bed creaked beneath her, as voices hushed and eyes burned holes in the fabric shielding her shame. She was not a woman. She was not ready. But none of that mattered. Her pain would be confirmation. Her silence would be preferred. Her tears would be ignored. In some kingdoms, a midwife would later inspect the sheets for blood. It was paraded through the halls as proof that the bride was pure and the groom had claimed her. That night the girl did not sleep. She lay still, eyes wide, listening to the murmurs outside her door. They would talk about her tomorrow, about how she flinched, about how long it took, about how pale she was. No one would ask if she was afraid. No one would ask if she felt safe. The ceremony had served its purpose. She had been broken in. By morning she could not walk. The silk sheets beneath her were stained dark, and the chamber reeked of blood and incense. Servants entered silently, their eyes lowered, pretending not to see the girl curled at the edge of the bed, shaking. The king had left hours ago. This was not uncommon. For a royal bride, pain was not just expected, it was required. In noble courts, the physical suffering of a girl after her wedding night served as proof. A limping walk, red-stained linens, a pale face, these were the signs of a job done properly. But the truth behind that evidence was unspeakable. These girls were children, often 10, 11, sometimes younger. Their bodies had not yet developed for intimacy, let alone childbirth. But still, they were expected to endure. The wedding night was only the beginning. It was the first test, one of many in a life built on obedience, sacrifice, and survival. The pain didn't stop with the ceremony. For many, what came next is worse. Some bled for days. Others developed infections untreated and unnamed, leading to fevers that killed them before their first winter. Many queens suffered damage to their hips and spines, permanent injuries from being forced into physical acts their bodies were not ready for. Midwives whispered about torn wombs and broken bones, but those were not matters to concern the crown. And yet, despite it all, they were expected to smile in public, to sit beside their husbands during court, to bow, to wave from balconies. If they cried, it was behind thick veils and locked doors. Queen Elenice of Northmere was 12 when she was married to a cousin of the emperor. Within a month, she was pregnant. Her pelvis had not fully formed. When labor came, it lasted 3 days. The baby was stillborn. Elenice nearly died from internal tearing. She couldn't stand unaided for over a year, but the court chronicler wrote, "The queen has fulfilled her noble purpose with dignity." That was her worth, what her body could produce even when it broke her. Many queens never had another child, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Their wombs were too damaged, their bodies too torn. Yet that failure to give the king an heir became their greatest shame. In royal eyes, a queen who could not produce sons was not injured. She was barren, cursed, useless, and she could be replaced. Some were locked away. One child queen was accused of witchcraft after 3 failed pregnancies. They said she had cursed her husband's bloodline. She was burned at 16. The physical horrors were rarely spoken aloud, but every girl knew. From the moment her engagement was announced, whispers followed her through the halls. Maids lowered their voices. Older women avoided her eyes. No one told her the truth. She simply learned it the way all queens did, through pain. A queen was a vessel. Her body existed to produce heirs, preferably sons. 1 was not enough. 2, at minimum. 3, to secure a dynasty. Many were still bleeding from their wedding night when they were told to try again. The danger wasn't hidden. Every woman at court had seen it. Queens fainting in labor, infants born too soon, blue and breathless, girls carried out of bedchambers unconscious, their faces white as marble. But silence was the rule. Pain was not discussed, only results. At 13, Queen Seraphina of Eldmore became pregnant with twins. Her hips were too narrow, her frame too fragile. The physician advised bed rest, but the king demanded public appearances. By the 6th month, her body gave out. She miscarried in front of a full banquet hall. The blood stained the stone floor. Her maid fainted, trying to carry her out. The babies were buried without names. Seraphina was pregnant again within 3 months. There were no recovery periods, no mourning allowed. If the womb was still capable, it was still valuable. Royal physicians monitored queens like livestock, tracking cycles, charting appetite, analyzing urine for signs of life. Every missed period triggered celebration. Every continued cycle drew concern. If a queen failed to conceive within a year, prayers turned to accusations. Infertility meant failure, and failure in the eyes of kings and council meant betrayal. Some queens turned to superstition. They wore fertility amulets, bathed in sacred springs, and drank potions made from crushed pearls or dried frog's liver. Others submitted to rituals that bordered on torture, boiling herbs, swallowing wax beads, sleeping with dead doves under their pillows. Nothing was off limits when air was at stake. The cruelty was systematic. If a queen died in childbirth but the baby lived, her death was treated as a sad inconvenience. If both died, it was a political crisis. But if only the mother survived, that was the worst outcome of all. A queen who failed to produce a child had no place at court. She had no shield. Queen Elira of Thornvale gave birth at 14. The baby survived 2 weeks. Elira, bleeding and delirious, asked to return to her mother's castle. The king refused. She was pregnant again within the year. Her body had not healed, and this time the child was breech. Both mother and baby died within hours. Elira's tomb was smaller than her wedding bed, and still the cycle continued. New brides arrived. New bloodlines were charted. Nothing changed. The crown required heirs, and queens, no matter how young or broken, were expected to deliver. At first, she simply spoke less, polite nods instead of answers, downcast eyes instead of questions. Courtiers called it grace. The king called it obedience. But the truth was far simpler. She was vanishing. This was the quiet unraveling no scroll recorded. The kind of collapse that didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't plead. It folded inwards. It waited. Day after day of being watched, expected, controlled, of smiling when they wanted to scream, broke something inside them, and once it cracked, there was no repairing it. Isolation accelerated the descent. Most royal brides were sent to foreign kingdoms far from family, culture, or language. Their maids were strangers. Their husbands were often cold, sometimes cruel. Every move was monitored. Every word weighed. Every failure weaponized. Queen Elira of Kermond, married at 11, stopped speaking entirely by 14. Servants whispered that she had become a saint. In truth, she spent her days sitting in the palace chapel, unmoving, staring at a stained glass window of the Virgin Mary. Her husband mocked her silence at banquets. Guests laughed. But the priest assigned to her later wrote, "I have seen death in many forms, none as quiet as hers." Others coped through obsessive prayer, fasting, or dangerous rituals. Faith became their only refuge, one they clung to desperately, even as their minds fractured. Some believed they were cursed, others thought they were being punished for sins they did not understand. Queen Lyra of Varenthia, unable to bear children, walked barefoot through snow to a mountaintop abbey, convinced she could pray her womb open. Her feet were frostbitten. She never walked again. Not every collapse was visible. Some queens performed perfectly. They smiled, they curtsied, they bore children, but behind closed doors they broke furniture, scratched mirrors, screamed into pillows. Their ladies in waiting kept their secrets. Until one day, they couldn't. One queen, name erased from records, was found sitting in a fountain at midnight, her wedding gown soaked, repeating the same phrase over and over, "I am not here. I am not here." It wasn't madness. It was mourning for the girl they once were, for the life they would never live, for the voice they no longer used. Some tried to write. Letters to sisters, mothers, childhood nurses. Most were intercepted, censored, or destroyed, but a few survived scraps of parchment stained with ink and salt water. One reads simply, "I wake and I remember. I wish I could forget." No one came to help them. Emotional suffering was weakness. Queens were meant to be composed, radiant, divine. To falter was to insult the crown. So they crumbled in secret. In locked rooms, in prayer cells, in garden corners where no one could see them shake. Their minds splintered not from insanity, but from unbearable clarity. They saw their cages for what they were, and they understood that escape was impossible. The world called them mad, but they were simply shattered. The journey took 9 days. She crossed rivers, mountains, and borders she had never seen on any map. When the gates of the foreign palace opened before her, she stepped inside, not as a guest, but as property. She was 13. She spoke only her native tongue. No one else did. This was the second cruelty, just as devastating as the first, exile. Nearly every royal bride was sent far from her homeland to marry a stranger who ruled a land of different customs, foods, languages, and expectations. She wasn't just removed from her family, she was severed from everything that gave her a sense of self. No childhood nurse. No smells of home. She was surrounded by strangers who didn't see her as a girl, but as an asset. They studied her movements. They whispered about her appearance. Every mistake was noted. Every word mispronounced became court gossip. She could not ask for help. She did not know the words. When she cried, no one understood her. When she was in pain, no one came. Her maid, assigned by the crown, spoke only the local dialect and offered no comfort. Queen Morelle of Harelin, a French princess married to an English duke, wrote in her diary, "I feel like a bird buried beneath glass. They see me, but they do not hear me. I am always performing." Never known. Letters home were censored or rewritten. Homesickness was considered weakness. Any longing for her own people was treated as disloyalty to her new husband's kingdom. Some queens were even forbidden to practice their native religion. One queen arrived with her family's prayer book. It was burned in front of her. For those few who brought companions from home, nurses, cousins, ladies in waiting, most were dismissed within the first year. The new court wanted full control. Comfort was a threat. Familiarity was rebellion. These girls learned quickly that their survival depended on submission, blending in, forgetting. They changed their names, their clothing, their food, their voice. They erased who they were because to remember was to suffer. The silence wasn't always literal, it was cultural, emotional. A slow erosion of self until nothing familiar remained. And so they sat through banquets where they didn't understand a single toast. They stood in ceremonies where no one explained what to do. They slept in beds that smelled of foreign oils, and they cried in rooms where no one knew their name. It wasn't just loneliness, it was erasure. They were not weak, they were not naive. They were not fragile girls lost in castles. They were survivors of a system designed to break them. Every child queen who crossed a border, changed her name, and lay beneath a stranger was engaging in a silent form of resistance, not because she fought back with weapons or rebellion, but because she endured. She bore pain in silence. She walked halls filled with enemies. She carried children she didn't ask for. She faced the horror of her wedding night and still rose the next morning. That is courage. It is easy to imagine strength as loud, shouting, fighting, conquering. But these girls showed another kind, the kind that whispers, that waits, that grieves behind closed doors and still shows up when called. That smiles through bruises, that learns a new language when hers is forbidden, that bows when she wants to run. They found power in survival. Some kept diaries in secret. Others befriended kitchen staff who taught them songs from home. A few passed coded notes to neighboring queens, forming invisible webs of support. They prayed not because they were blind, but because they had no one else to trust. Even those who broke, who stopped eating, who stopped speaking, showed a truth the world refused to hear. This was not life. This was captivity. Yet within that captivity, they preserved something sacred. The memory of who they were before the veil, before the blood, before the silence. And that memory kept them human. Remember the girl in white, standing in silence before the great doors. She was not just a bride. She was a child, a daughter, a dreamer. She once chased birds through palace gardens and pressed flowers into books. But none of that survived her wedding night. Behind every medieval crown was a frightened girl whose voice was stolen long before history tried to silence her. These queens are more than names on parchment. They were real. They bled. They broke. They endured. Their stories were never meant to be told. Their pain was hidden behind velvet curtains and stone walls. But today, you've seen what those walls concealed. You've heard the truth buried beneath centuries of ceremony and myth. So, remember them, not as queens, not as wives, but as girls forced into a role they never chose, walking toward a fate they never deserved, with a strength they were never credited for. Speak their names even if they've been erased. Light a candle for those who had no voice, and carry their memory forward, not in pity, but in honor, because silence was forced upon them. But remembering them is a choice we make.